back through the Caterosaurus patent, which we all know most of us live on a portion of the Caterosaurus patent. I know Ellen's been going crazy, her and Jim, for years trying to figure out where in the town park it connects with the Van Skyke patent and the Caterosaurus. We're kind of at a crossroads here, but nobody knows exactly where that point is. But John has researched where on the Caterosaurus patent his property is, so he's done extensive research on it, and we kind of compiled all of his research that he did give us a copy. We've made this Mott Family Empire, and all of John's research is in here too. So we're going to have this out on display for anybody who wants to go through it at any time as part of our library. As you can see how things have changed just a little bit around here, so we got all the library books are all together. Ellen has started working on this. It's going to be the kitchen display. It's been up before, like over in the town hall, but this will be a really nice display area here. Just kind of reorganizing things just a little bit. But we'll have this out for people to take a look at. These are boards that we've had over at the town hall in the past, kind of going through the Mott story. Now, when John was talking about his history of his family and when they were living on the property, and he just got a little mention about the first deed was deeded to Zebulon Mott in 1795. And you just kind of listening to that Mott story. They lived in an apple orchard, and it just, you Googled it, and all of a sudden these things kept hitting all over the place. So what we've done is kind of gone through, it's 5 generations that tells the story of the Mott Applesauce Company. And when you take a look at any of their jars, it says right on the top, since 1842. And that date, 1842, is when the Mott company started, and it started when generation number 3 was 16 years old. So Zebulon Mott, he was the first deed holder in 1795. He was also our 3rd town supervisor. He also served at the legislature, so they were very people who were really connected with the town and doing a lot of extra work in that department. And he was also the deacon of the church that was close by, and he is buried in that cemetery. So if you're going down Prime Hill Road toward Mechanicville, when you get to that intersection, the 4-way stop, you got the cemetery over to your left. Just go down that road just a little bit, and that's where the Krasuski Mott Farm is. The property has been sold, and they're going to be putting a development there. It has not completely passed yet, but it's going to be called the Mott Orchard PDD, which is really rather nice. So Zebulon was out walking through his orchards with his grandson. His son John lived next door to him, but John's son, Samuel Rogers Mott, he and his grandfather, Zebulon, were walking through the orchard, and it was his grandfather that told John the story of the fermentation process of the apples in their orchard and him coming up with the apple cider vinegar. So when John was 16 years old, he started making some of the vinegar and selling it to the neighbors. 1842. So that's when you look up the Mott's company on the internet, it's going to tell you that that's when the company started, and it started right here on Farm to Market Road when Samuel was just 16 years old. Samuel, when he got married, he and his wife and his 4 younger children, one of the children was a little bit older, kind of on his own, moved down to Brookville, New York, and he bought a 3rd interest in another cider vinegar factory, and eventually bought out the other 2 partners. And just like the grandfather, he was also the supervisor in his town, and it was in Madison, in New York State. And for 17 years, he also worked at, he was in the New York State Assembly. So just kind of following his grandfather's footsteps. Samuel's son, John Kuhn Mott, and Kuhn was his mom's maiden name. He moved to New York City, which was just coming from Brookville, just down a little bit closer to the city, and he opened up a factory. This is generation number 4. And we all kind of know where like the Jacob Javits Convention Center is down in New York City. That's where the factory was. So later on, when the factory was down, it's now the Jacob Javits Center, so it kind of gives you an idea. I think that's around here, 72, down where the Jacob Javits Center is today. At which point the father and the son merged their companies, and that's when they really took off. It's amazing. I did go through some of the figures. Between 1882, they were processing 14 carloads of apples. which kind of equated to 600 barrels of juice a day. And the New York State guidelines said each barrel had to have 25 gallons. So that's 15,000 gallons that they were doing in 1882. In a mere 5 short years, it's amazing how exponentially that when the father and the son merged their companies together, how much more that they did, and within 5 years it just went kind of crazy. And when you take a look at John Kuhn Mott, he was generation number 4. He had a son, Charles Stewart Mott, and that's the big boy. And he was generation number 5. And by this time, they are shipping their apples internationally. They've got the boats taking it over to Europe and things. They are doing their exhibits at World's Fairs. They did one in Chicago. They did the Philadelphia Centennial Expedition. So they are really, the company is really gaining a lot of popularity. And Charles Mott actually went to college. I think he went to college in Germany and France, learning more about the fermentation process. But in the meantime, there's a lot of kids working the companies, and they got a couple of extra little companies that they're doing. You know, people have different interests, as well as the applesauce company. And during the 30s, when it was the Depression, and so many businesses went under, their business actually thrived. I mean, you know, it's a product that everybody is using, and their company actually thrived during the Depression, which was quite a testimony to the family business. Charles Stewart Mott, he bought from his uncle Frederick a little company called Wheelworks, and Wheelworks sold bicycle wheels. Everybody's going around in bicycle wheels, and it was the rubber process and everything else, so he bought this little company called Wheelworks. And he was also working the applesauce company too, but the Wheelworks was his little side baby. And he decided to move his family to Flint, Michigan. And that was in 1906 that he moved the company to Flint, Michigan, which the little Wheelworks company was noticed by an up-and-coming company in Michigan. So the company decided they wanted to buy his Wheelworks company. And Charles said, I will sell you my company, 49% of my company, but I don't want any money. I just want to have some stock in your new company. And then the following 2 years later, he sold the rest of his Wheelworks company to the same up-and-coming company for more stock. Well, that new little company that was opening up in Michigan turned out to be General Motors. So he ends up being the #1 stockholder in General Motors. He ends up being the chief of the General Motors Advisory Board of Directors, and he served a total of 60 years at General Motors Board of Directors until he died at 98 years old, which was in like 1973. So, you know, it seemed like a long time. 1795, when Zebulon was the first deed holder right down the road, and it was only a mere 5 generations, and now you've got this fellow who sold his company to General Motors. But his motto always was, what I am worth is what I do for other people. And he started a foundation, the Mott Foundation, which still exists today. He started that foundation in 1926. And in his lifetime, because he died in 1973, he donated $130 million to different charities, and most of them were schools. He really had an affiliation with the schools. But his wife and his children have certainly taken it, and it still exists today. He also was said, let us be known by our deeds, and certainly he was quite a model for that there. His wife was Ruth Rawlings Mott, and she made sure that she carried on in his way as well as the children. But let me see. He also was one of the first self-made billionaires in the United States. And to think that just 5 generations, it started right down the road here on Farm to Market in Pine Hill. And how many of the Mott family is also buried in that cemetery. I've got the pictures because John Krasuski went and took some pictures, and starting right from Zebulon, his wife, they had twin daughters, they're there, and his son John is over there too. So the family stayed pretty close in this area until the 3rd generation moved down to Brookville. So it really is quite interesting that sometimes you get just a little piece of John's story. He goes into detail about his way of growing up, and just kind of taking a look over the property that he grew up on, and just seeing his idea of what he grew up with, but then looking back to see what the other generations previous saw also. And it just started with the grandfather and his grandson just walking through the orchards and just telling them the stories of the apples. I know many times I learned more from my grandfather when I was a kid, because my father didn't have the temperament to allow me to do a whole lot of things, but my grandfather had the time to do it, you know. Our grandfathers are just the best. And to think that this whole empire started with just stories from the grandfather. So I think that's pretty well.
Can you take a question?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I might even be able to answer it.
Up to this point, is it just apple vinegar?
No, they were certainly going into more products. I have a timeline right here, the key dates in the Mott Company, some of the things that they went into. They went into the real lime and real lemon. Remember, you get those green jars when they did that. They actually went into Snapple and things, different things like that. Let me see. Cadbury Schweppes, they got into like the ginger ale stuff, so you know that had the carbonation and stuff like that. One of them had gone to school, I think it was a Charles Stewart, and got into carbonation as well as the fermentation process. Okay. So Cadbury, they got into Cadbury. So there's a lot of different things that they had eventually gone into. I think it was Duffy, another company that they merged with, and they got into prune juice and a whole bunch of different things. So this one here's got kind of like the key dates of starting from the 1842 when they were doing the cider vinegar, right, and where they ended up in 2008. In 2008, Cadbury, Schweppes, and Mott's as part of the Dr. Pepper Snapple group. So they really diversified.
Yeah.
And got rid of the wagon wheels there, but the bicycle wheels, but certainly gave enough capital to go and play whatever kind of game they wanted to play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, in the beginning, when they were making the cider vinegar, it was done by horsepower. If you can kind of remember, even like when they do the flour with the, you know, the stone presses, and they have the horses walking them around. So they crushed the apples between two large stone drums. And that's how they started small, and then it just kind of progressed. They shoveled the crushed apples into a crib, packed in straw, and pressed by 3 men leaning on a level that operated a jack screw. The juice ran into a tank that was ready to be bottled. So that's how they started, very primitive. The horsepower was replaced by water power and steam. And as I was saying, how much they were able to produce at that level. At one point in 1887, they were so busy, for 8 weeks, the mill ran day and night, using 5,500 bushels of apple per day, which was 300,000 bushels per season. And they got to the point where they had to go like out of state, you know, to get the apples, because they were producing that much of the different products. It's really quite an amazing thing. And it all became from John reading, just talking about his little story. This is a story that Sandy wrote, and I'll just kind of go through it just quickly. Holding on to history has become easier in this day of high-speed internet and ready accessibility of records. And holding on to history has become more difficult in this day of rapid development and the continuing loss of physical connections to our past. John Krasuski, a lifelong resident of Halfmoon, is walking both sides of that path. She talks so much better than I do. John was raised on a farm in the northern end of town, and when his dad passed away recently, he wanted to learn all he could about the home and the land that are his heritage. Looking through the old deeds his parents had, he was fascinated by the backward progression that led him through Halfmoon of the 20th century, and he began to search the road back, hoping to reach the town's beginnings in the 17th century. His parents, Frank and Helen Krasuski, purchased the 100-acre dairy farm in 1944. They milked cows in a barn, which was built in 1868 in the popular threshing style, to which they built in addition in 1964, enabling them to increase their milking herd to 35 cows. John says that as a child, he was intrigued by the initials carved into one of the hand-hewn beams in the old part. He says that there's a large flat rock in the front of the house that he recalls being told was a stepping stone from which the ladies could climb up into horse-drawn carriages, vestiges of a time long gone. He recalls that his brother Frank attended the school in the one-room Quonset hut schoolhouse that stood just up the road on the corner of Farm to Market Road and Angle Lane when there was yet to be a Shenendehowa Central School. He himself went to second grade in the Jonesville Academy in the district's formative years. I did too. And it was an interesting journey John traveled as he traced his farm's origins all the way back to the 1740s. Through old deeds, censuses, town and county roads, a map of the old Caterosaurus patent, and an 1860 reproduction map of the town of Halfmoon, and on the online site for Sylvester's History of Saratoga County, he pieced together a puzzle that showed the Krasuski land changing hands numerous times over the 2 centuries, and all his findings are all in the binder. As part of the original Caterosaurus patent, when lands that are now Halfmoon were parceled out to investors and friends of colonial leaders, his land came into the hands of one Zebulon Mott, a man who was very prominent in the town's history. With what is now the Krasuski property deeded to him in 1795, it appears that Mr. Mott was the farm's original developer and owner. He was a deacon of the nearby First Baptist Church, which stood the corner of what is now Pine Hill Road and Farm to Market Road. That church building was subsequently moved a mile away to what is called Newtown, but the cemetery remains. Eventually, the First Baptist Church relocated to Middletown, but Mr. Mott is buried in the original cemetery along with other earlier settlers of the town. Zebulon Mott was the town supervisor from 1801 until 1817. His son John Mott owned the adjacent farm to the west. With the acres farm fully diversified and self-sufficient, most of them had extensive orchards. John learned that John Mott's son Samuel Rogers Mott earned a niche in the history when he took the tricks of the trade he learned from his grandfather back in Halfmoon and developed a prize-winning pasteurized process for cider and vinegar, building an apple processing empire that still exists today as Mott's Inc. And that's where we kind of took the story from there and created all this just from the internet. By the mid-19th century, many of the farms in the northeastern corner of Halfmoon, including the Krasuskis, belonged to members of the prominent Baker family. John finds it interesting that in searching back through the old deeds, that reference points marking property lines were called saplings, stones, trees, rock piles, or other people's boundaries. And it is a hoot when you go up to the county and look at these old deeds, because these saplings and everything else are long gone, but those were the property boundaries. Not quite as scientific as today's surveys. Another interesting point John noted was that most often sale of property occurred in the spring, which leads one to believe that the farmers hoped to bring in a good crop that would pay for the land purchase. He remembers being told that there was a large brick house on his family farm, possibly built during the Baker's family's ownership, that burned to the ground back in the 1930s. It was a substantial house, much bigger than the one that was rebuilt on the original foundation and the one in which John's mother lived for more than 60 years. John said that the search process is made relatively easy as each deed in the Saratoga County Clerk's office references preceding deeds by book and page number. Through his search, he found his family's home went from Mott to Eddy to Baker to Hitchcock to Coons, all familiar names in the history of the town. As Eastern European migration intensified in the 20th century, he finds names such as, I can't pronounce them, on the deeds, as these new immigrants found hope and promise of prosperity in the fertile and rolling lands of Halfmoon. Searching the records, noting names, dates of sale, one sometimes finds the impact of historic events on one family. When you compare the transfer of title to events of the time, you often find that personal struggles such as bank failures, death, war service, epidemics, or even waves of immigration had an effect on property sales. The history of a farm, the history of a family, the history of a town, or the history of a nation, the history of the world, all linked together, joined over centuries in a paper trail. For John Krasuski, the connection to 250 years of his family farm's legacy took on a particular poignancy when he stood at the Hilltop Cemetery along Zebulon Mott's well-weathered gravestone a while back. Through the trees, he could see the far hill and the farm where he grew up. The same farm where the man who lay at his feet had tilled the soil, loved the land, raised a family, and prepared the ways for generations to follow, just as his own family has, links in the never-ending chain of history. Sandy McBride. So I thought that was just a wonderful story, so I have made some extra copies of this. If anybody would like to read the story. And like I said, she's got so many other stories in there, but this is the one that we were kind of focusing on today. So I hope you enjoyed this little story. We got a couple of Mott products.